I don't know about you, but Star Trek just isn't what it used to be. I've tried watching Picard and Discovery, and they just didn't do it for me. I've yet to watch Season 2 of Strange New Worlds. I really enjoyed Season 1, so hopefully things are moving in the right direction there, but I just missed the old Star Trek. Standalone episodes filled with plenty of philosophical dilemmas. And luckily for me, there is a Star Trek alternative, the Orville. And it is fantastic. Whether we've seen the shows or not, we've all heard of the greats, Captain Kirk, Captain Picard, and so many more. But how does Captain Ed Mercer of the Orville stand up? Ed Mercer is a likable guy. He's funny, caring, compassionate, and brave. He's willing to put his life on the line for any of his crew, but is that enough to make him a good captain? In this video, I'm going to explore his character in depth, as I believe, despite the good characteristics I just mentioned, that not only is he not a good captain, but in fact, he's actually a terrible one. Hi, I'm Alex. I make video games and I like to make videos about them and game design. I also make video essays like this one where I explore a story or a character. If that kind of content interests you, please consider subscribing. The Orville started as a comedy. It was a parody of Star Trek, but has gotten more serious as the seasons went on, but never losing that comedic element. It has touched on things in ways that Star Trek can't or hasn't. Like, for example, Lieutenant Commander Bortus's, holodeck addiction. And yet, despite the humor of these situations, the show actually takes the concepts it deals with seriously. The show is excellently written and very well acted, and I've been thinking a lot about this because the more I've watched this show, the more Captain Mercer's inadequacies as a captain stand out to me. And it makes sense. The initial premise of the show, that through nepotism and a lack of captains for an immense fleet, Ed Mercer was offered the role of captain on the Orville. The show was very much a comedy in Season 1, and so his inadequacies as a leader made for some funny situations, but as the show grew into a more serious drama by Season 3, there were moments that I actually hated the captain, which is ultimately what inspired me to make this video, to go back and reassess why I thought he was a bad captain. I found a few key characteristics that explain why this is, but the first one, you're not going to guess this one. When it comes to the ladies, or in one episode, men, Ed Mercer is no Captain Kirk. Now you may be thinking, well, hold on a minute, being bad with women doesn't make you a bad captain, and that's true on its own, but it does make you a bad captain when that very characteristic compromises your ability to command. And with Captain Mercer, it very much does. In the first episode of the show, we see Ed returning home from work, only to discover that his wife, Kelly Grayson, is cheating on him. Long story short, they get divorced but end up working together on the Orville many years later. Kelly works as Ed Mercer's first officer, and he still has feelings for her. Now, when it comes to the dynamic of spouses, family working together, that could be a long conversation in and of itself, and I'd rather keep things simple, so I'll just say this. That type of working relationship is typically frowned upon, if not outright banned, specifically when we start getting into dangerous job scenarios. If the safety of your loved one compromises your ability to make impartial decisions, and it's typically seen as best to just avoid that situation. And they even have a serious conversation about this. But Ed still disregards that logic and attempts to get back with her once more. One of the more egregious scenarios is in Season 2, Episode 13, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, where after talking about when they first started dating, some kind of weird temporal accident happens and a younger version of Kelly gets teleported to the future. Everyone does their best to adapt and are starting to get used to the new situation, but for young Kelly, she has just had a date with young Ed a night ago from her perspective. She likes Ed and wants to go on another date with him, and so she asks him out. Now, what he does next at first seems admirable but quickly falls apart. He goes to present Kelly to ask for her permission to go on a date with her younger self, but then he says this: all you have to do is say you want to try again with me and I won't even consider this. Okay, so we've got to unpack something before we address that. First, we have to address the situation itself. This is a very weird position to be in for both of them. And for Ed, I honestly don't know what the right thing to do here is. There is no rule book. The way I see it, you have two choices if you want to go on a date with Kelly's younger self. You either ask for present Kelly's permission and accept whatever decision she makes, or you don't ask present Kelly's permission, as they are essentially the same person. But I'll tell you 100% what you don't do And that is what we have to address next, and that is what Ed said to President Kelly. He's not asking for permission to date her younger self. Instead, he is using young Kelly's interest in him as some sort of twisted emotional chess piece to blackmail President Kelly into getting back together with him. This is an HR nightmare. What does this say about him as a captain? To me, it says he has no integrity, but that might be a bit of a stretch. But he is manipulating not one, but two versions of the same person, a person who is very close to him, and if that is how he treats someone he loves, how can he be trusted to take care of an entire ship? President Kelly turns him down, and after this he decides to go out with young Kelly. I could go on about this, but there's a lot more I have to cover, and the situation, although as very distressing and not cool as it is ultimately only distressing to him and both Kellys. In Season 2, we learn that the Kaylon, the race of beings that Isaac belongs to, have genocided their biological creators and are planning on exterminating all biological life in the galaxy. Isaac's mission was thought to be a learning experience where he gathered information on biologicals while on board the Orville so that the Kaylon could make an informed decision about joining the Union. But in reality, it was just to learn enough about them to decide if they were worth preserving or not. A test in which the Union failed. This led the Kaylon Armada to head to Earth, where this big battle happened, which the Union won only thanks to the Krill who assisted in the battle. Isaac played a hand in defeating the Kaylon too, however, as his relationship with the ship's doctor and her kids swayed his behavior into turning on his species and helping the humans. After the battle, Ed Mercer convinced the Union Admiralty, who wanted to shut down Isaac, to keep Isaac activated and in service to the Union as he was their best defense against the Kaylon threat. This battle scarred many humans, including Ensign Burke, who we meet in Season 3. Her best friend and love interest was killed during the battle, and her ship was destroyed, which is presumably why she was transferred to the Orville. She can't stand seeing Isaac every day, knowing that it was his fault that the Kaylon had the information they needed to attack Earth. Her friend's death was undeniably a result of his actions. She talks to Captain Mercer about it in his office, and this is what he says. "It's heresy for a captain to admit this, but I'm not sure you're wrong. I made this decision, and I'm still not sure it was the right one." This is absolutely one of the most egregious things he's said as a captain up to this point. He is right, it is heresy. You do not say that kind of thing as a captain. It is reasonable that he would feel conflicted about this choice, but that's not something you tell to a subordinate who is having trouble working with someone who is the cause of a loved one's death. She needs to hear that he was confident with his decision, that there is logic to the decision even if she doesn't see it or like it. And there are absolutely logical, pragmatic reasons for the decision that Captain Mercer made, and in fact, I think he made the right call, and he explains these reasons to Ensign Burke in his speech as well, but in my opinion, only the pragmatic reasons should have been explained. She likely wouldn't have changed her mind after the conversation, but at least she can move on with the knowledge that the captain has solid reasoning for the decision he made and feels confident in that decision. What I can't get over is why he shared this in the first place. How is anyone supposed to feel about that? He probably sees this as being open and transparent with his crew, but all it does is erode trust and respect for his authority. Since the crew are obeying his commands, they need to feel confident that they are doing the right thing by following his orders. If this is not the case, it affects crew morale, and this can affect the performance of their duties. And in a crisis situation, the captain needs everyone on point, and they need to feel comforted that he knows how to handle the situation, even if they disagree. If they don't respect his authority, it can cause anxiety, apprehension, and confusion for the crewmates, and that impacts the smooth operation of the ship. And we see this in Ensign Burke as the show continues. Now, she continues to perform her duties admirably, and that just goes to show a lot about her character in general, but there is still clear dissent brewing inside her, as she now feels even more certain now that Isaac being on the bridge is the wrong decision, and no longer is a feeling of security that the captain has made the right decisions in this scenario. We've just seen how his honesty and openness have caused a huge problem for a member of his crew, but what happens when he decides to be dishonest to an entire species? After the Kaylon attack, the Union needs to strengthen itself due to political situations and is therefore looking to integrate a species called the Genesee into the Union. The Genesee are a species dominated by females, and the males of their species are relegated to a second class. It is the job of the Orville to talk with the Genesee and convince them to join the Union, but the plan they come up with is absolutely horrendous. They decide to trick the Genesee by pretending to be different roles. All the females will pretend to take the leadership roles, with Kelly pretending to be the captain, and all the men pretending to be low-ranking personnel. They even kick Bortus, a member of a species called Mocklin that is a patriarchal species, off the bridge because they don't want the Genesee seeing that they work with him, until the time is right, anyway. That's right, they are starting this relationship with the species they want to join the Union by lying and deceiving them. But the ends justify the means, right? When the Genesee delegation comes on board, the leader of the delegation makes it clear that they are there to make sure that they are compatible with each other. To make matters worse, Ed and Malloy are purposely acting goofy and incompetent. And your first thought might be that the writing staff was just a bit incompetent in this episode, but they aren't. In fact, they know exactly what they are doing because once the ruse is revealed, the Genesee say everything we've been thinking and are appalled they've been lied to. After Ed and Kelly explain themselves, the Genesee leave with the negotiations being over. However, they do leave on an uncertain note, saying that they are still willing to talk with a diplomat, hinting that they still may be open to discussing membership in the future, and also hinting that perhaps the lesson Ed and Kelly were trying to teach the Genesee that men and women should be equal may have rubbed off a little. This shows me how a bad decision can be rewarded with luck. But beyond shutting down the talks of having the Genesee join the Union, this would have had effects on crew morale too. I can't help but think how I'd react to this as a crew member during this event. I definitely wouldn't feel good about it. This would likely have caused the crew to distrust the captain because it's one thing to deceive the enemy, that's understandable, but it's an entirely different thing to deceive a whole species that is trying to be our ally. If he is willing to lie on such a grand scale to an ally, what could he be lying to us about? And furthermore, it wouldn't take a senior officer to wonder what was going to happen should the Genesee join the Union under these false pretenses. The reaction would probably have been far worse, because it wouldn't have just been the delegation that was deceived, but an entire civilization, and that is no way to begin a relationship. They'd likely feel enraged and embarrassed, and rightfully so. This could even cause them to become enemies. It's clear this plan was a horrible one, and it made me realize that the Orville is very much like Star Trek, except for one key difference. Star Trek shows us how complex problems are handled by a competent command team, whereas the Orville shows us how problems are handled by a less competent team. And I think that's actually brilliant, because sometimes we can learn more from our mistakes. After all, there's a reason why I'm making this video on the Orville rather than Star Trek, because seeing these situations being handled in a less than ideal way is compelling, making us think, what was the right approach? Everything I've presented so far has been pretty bad, but what I'm about to present is by far the worst trait Ed has as a captain. In fact, if it wasn't for some of the traits I've presented already, I very much could be wondering if Ed Mercer is actually a psychopath. Now we are going to dive into an episode where I literally hated the captain at one point. But to talk about this episode, I need to talk about another one first. In Season 2, Episode 11, an archaeological dig revealed a time capsule from 2015 that contained an old iPhone that once belonged to a woman named Laura Huggins. Gordon Malloy checks out the phone and feels a connection with this woman who has been dead for centuries. So he brings the phone to the simulator to generate a program based off the information contained in the phone, and ends up in a simulation of her life in 2015. He falls in love with her, and it doesn't really end well, as it ultimately couldn't. It's a fantastic episode, and I highly recommend giving it a watch. But that's not the episode I'm going to be diving into in this section. In Season 3, Episode 6, there is a device that accidentally sends Lieutenant Malloy back in time to early 21st century Earth. He sends a distress message to a point in space 400 light years away that he knows the Orville will likely be 400 years in the future, with the hopes that they receive the message at the right time and find a way to come back in time to rescue him. He knows it's a long shot, but the Orville does in fact get the message, and they do find a way to go back and get him, but they mess up and arrive 10 years too late. Ed and Kelly go down to the surface to get Gordon, while Burke and Isaac go down to find an alternative alternative power source so they can travel back to the future once they get Gordon. Ed and Kelly track down Malloy, and it turns out he's working a job as an airplane pilot. Malloy drives Ed and Kelly back to his house, and Ed and Kelly's anger is rising. You see, in the Orville universe, tampering with history is illegal due to the ramifications it can cause, which is completely understandable. Kelly mentions that he'd have to answer for this when he gets back, but he tells them he's not going back. Malloy shows Kelly and Ed into his house, and they meet his family. His son and pregnant wife, who happens to be the real-life Laura Huggins from the Season 2 episode I mentioned earlier. When Ed and Kelly see that he has a family, they lose it on Malloy, and they go into a bedroom to hash it out. Ed and Kelly give a holier-than-thou speech about how the rules of time travel tell a person that if they find themselves stranded in time, to remove themselves from society and remain as hidden as possible. And Malloy said that he did that for 3 years and survived by killing and eating animals, which in the future is illegal, and that eventually he just couldn't do it anymore, that humans are social animals who need connection. Ed and Kelly's inability to grasp this made me mad. In this episode, I truly empathize with Malloy, and don't get me wrong, I understand where Ed and Kelly are coming from. In fact, from an objective viewpoint, I ultimately agree with their opinion on tampering with the timeline. We've seen what can happen when a timeline is tampered with in previous episodes of the show, so it is a big deal. The problem I have, though, is the way they handle the situation with Gordon, because things are a bit more complex than just the big picture view on tampering with the timeline. The law is all well and good in theory, but in practice it's a bit more complex, and because we know it's complex, their reaction seems all the more strange because, to make a simple analogy, it would be like getting mad at a homeless person for stealing food. Yeah, stealing is wrong and illegal, but come on, the person needs food. We can still understand and be compassionate about the situation. Yes, changing a timeline is magnitudes more serious than stealing food, but Ed and Kelly's inability to grasp Gordon's actions and at the very least show some compassion to someone who has to deal with such a horrifying reality of being lost in another time, centuries separated from friends and family, completely alone and obligated to stay hidden, is what truly perplexes me. They ask him to come back, but he declines, and what happens next is unforgivable. In the cover of night, Ed and Kelly return to Malloy's house with Tala, the super-strong Selayan chief of security officer. They intend to bring Malloy back against his will in front of his family. He pulls out his gun to defend himself. He warns them that it'll just be a stun, but enough time for him and his family to disappear. Ed gets notified by the Orville that Isaac and Burke have secured the resource they gathered that allows the ship to time travel. What this means is that they can jump back 10 years in the past and get Gordon when he was still hiding, and this whole timeline would be erased, including Gordon's son and his unborn child. Ed and Kelly give each other a smug look, knowing that they no longer need to get this Gordon. Here's the problem though. Ed and Kelly's problem is solved. They no longer need this Gordon. They can just leave and go back in time and cleanly change the timeline with no issues. But instead of just leaving and saying, okay Gordon, have it your way, we'll leave, Ed tells Gordon exactly what they are going to do. He smugly tells Gordon that they are going to go back in time to save his younger self who is looking for help. Malloy points out that this means his children will be erased from existence, which he says is essentially murder. Ed just says see you soon as he leaves, which I find to be very sinister and twisted, and he, Kelly, and Tala leave and head back to the ship, while Malloy and his family are left to live the last few minutes of their lives in horror as they know their reality, their happy family, is going to be destroyed at any moment, and they'll never know it, never know the lives they've lost. That's Cthulhu-level cosmic horror, if you ask me. This is one of my favorite episodes. It is incredibly well written and acted, which is why I have such a strong reaction to it. It just really bothers me as a viewer, watching a character I'm supposed to sympathize with torture a person and his innocent family right before their existence ends, when that is completely unnecessary. That's psychopathic. But because I've been writing this video and rewatching episodes, I realize it's not psychopathy, but rather his oversharing without thinking tendency that we've visited before. Nonetheless, I can no longer respect him as a character. And it was really this episode of the show that really inspired this video essay in the first place, that really made me go back and look out for his other flaws. So we looked at some of his worst case scenarios, but you may be thinking, well, actually he is a good captain because of his scores at the Academy, because of his role in defeating the Kaylons, and his role of bringing peace with the Kaylons, and many more occasions. And you'd be right to think that. He's done a lot of great things, and if we remove the negative characteristics I've been highlighting, I might actually have called him a good captain. In fact, I'd probably call him a great one. But the way I see it, a bad captain can also be good, but a good captain can't also be bad. And Captain Mercer has a lot to work on before I can call him great. But I hope we get many more seasons for years to come so we can watch his growth. Because if we get to see him overcome these negative traits, then he may just become one of the best characters in the Orville or Star Trek. If you're not convinced, let me know. There are a lot of other scenarios I wasn't able to squeeze in without doubling the length of this video, such as the Topa episodes, the Talea episodes, and more. And I'd really like to cover those, so I may do a part 2 regardless. But what do you think of all of this? Is this a show that you watch, or perhaps one that you haven't watched but may give a shot now that you know more about it? Let me know in the comments. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.